A dead man cannot type a suicide note. That is a biological fact. But in the luxury apartment of Judge Alvaro, the evidence said otherwise. The gun was in his hand. The door was locked from the inside, and the signed confession was sitting perfectly on his mahogany desk. It looked like the perfect suicide. But I saw something the forensics team missed: the paper itself. It told me that this note wasn't written the night he died. It was written 3 weeks ago, back when he still thought he was safe. Before we analyze the evidence that broke this alibi, make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss a single clue. Now, let's step into the silence of a luxury apartment in Madrid's Salamanca district. Madrid at 3:00 a.m. has a very specific texture. In the southern neighborhoods like Vallecas, the silence feels heavy, like people are resting before another fight for survival. But here, in the Salamanca district, the silence feels expensive. It smells like manicured hedges and stone that gets power washed every week. I parked my unmarked car on Calle de Serrano, the blue lights of the patrol cruisers bouncing off the windows of the luxury boutiques. I didn't rush. After 30 years in the Policía Nacional, you learn that the dead are patient. They aren't going anywhere. I am Inspector Raul. I'm 55 years old. My knees hurt when it rains, and I have seen enough bodies to fill the Santiago Bernabeu Stadium. Tonight, the body belonged to Judge Manuel Alvaro. Inspector! A young uniformed officer nodded as I ducked under the police tape. He looked pale. It's on the 4th floor. The housekeeper found him. It looks straightforward. Straightforward is a dangerous word in police work. In my experience, nothing involving a high court judge is ever straightforward. It is usually political, messy, and buried under layers of favors and lies. I took the elevator up. The apartment was what you would expect: mahogany furniture, leather books that had probably never been opened, and art on the walls that cost more than my pension. The air inside was still, smelling faintly of gunpowder and expensive cologne. The judge was sitting in his leather office chair, slumped forward. I pulled on my latex gloves and approached the desk. I didn't look at his face yet. I looked at his hands. His right hand was resting on the desk, a black pistol, a Glock 19, loose near his fingers. There was stippling on his right temple, powder burns, contact shot. From the doorway, it was the picture-perfect suicide. A tragic end for a man known for his harsh sentencing and ironclad reputation. No signs of struggle. The forensic technician, Elena, said. She was snapping photos of the blood spatter on the bookshelf behind the victim. Door was locked from the inside, window sealed. Housekeeper has a key. She came in to clean at 10 p.m. and found him. She's in the kitchen having a panic attack. And the note, I asked? On the desk, front and center. I leaned in. The note was typed. A single sheet of A4 paper, placed perfectly parallel to the edge of the desk. It was brief. I have betrayed the trust placed in me. I cannot live with the shame of what is to come. Forgive me. It was signed at the bottom in blue ink. Manuel Alvaro. I recognized the signature from hundreds of warrants he had signed over the years. It was flamboyant, aggressive. I stared at the paper. Something bothered me. It wasn't the words. Suicide notes are often melodramatic. It was the object itself. Elena, I said, my voice low. Look at the printer. The printer was a high-end laser model, sitting on a side table to my left. The paper tray was open. It was stacked with a fresh ream of bright, ultra-white premium paper, the kind that blinds you under the fluorescent lights. I looked back at the suicide note. Under the harsh light of the desk lamp, the paper of the note didn't match the paper in the tray. The note was slightly creamy, and the edges, the top edge of the paper had a faint, almost invisible yellow discoloration. Elena, I pointed a gloved finger, careful not to touch the evidence. This sheet of paper didn't come from that printer tonight. What do you mean? Look at the yellowing on the top edge, I explained, squinting. That happens when paper sits in a stack, exposed to air or sunlight, for a long time. The top sheet gets burned by the light, but the paper in the printer is fresh. White, brand new. I looked around the room. There were no other stacks of paper. The office was immaculate. This note wasn't printed today, I said, the feeling of unease settling in my stomach like a cold stone. And if he decided to kill himself tonight in a fit of despair, why did he use a piece of paper that looks like it's been sitting on a shelf for a month? Elena lowered her camera. Maybe he printed it weeks ago. Maybe he's been planning this. Maybe, I said. Or maybe someone else brought this paper into the room. I walked over to the window and looked down at the empty streets of Madrid. The jefe. My boss was going to hate this. He wanted a suicide. He wanted the case closed before the morning news. But the yellow edge of that paper was screaming at me. The judge didn't write a note before he died. That note was already waiting for him. Seal the room, I ordered, turning back to the body. And get the housekeeper. I want to know exactly who visited this apartment in the last month. This isn't a suicide. Elena, it's a stage play. I looked around the room. There were no other stacks of paper. The office was immaculate. This note wasn't printed today, I said, the feeling of unease settling in my stomach like a cold stone. And if he decided to kill himself tonight in a fit of despair, why did he use a piece of paper that looks like it's been sitting on a shelf for a month? Elena lowered her camera. Maybe he printed it weeks ago. Maybe he's been planning this. Maybe, I said. Or maybe someone else brought this paper into the room. I turned away from the dead man. The physical evidence had told me a lie, so now I needed to hear the truth from a living person. Seal the room. Elena, I ordered, stripping off my gloves as I walked toward the door. I'm going to talk to the housekeeper. If this is a stage play, I want to know who the other actors are. I found her in the kitchen down the hall. The contrast was jarring. The study smelled of death and gunpowder. But here, it smelled of lemon polish and fear. The housekeeper, Maria, was sitting at the small kitchen island. She was a robust woman, 60 years old, the kind of person who usually ran a household with military precision. Now, she looked small. Her hands were wrapped around a glass of water that was shaking so hard it made a clicking sound against her ring. I didn't start with the hard questions immediately. I leaned against the counter, letting her see that I wasn't just another uniform. I was a listener. Maria, I said softly, the note on his desk? Did you ever see him writing it? She looked up, eyes red. No, Inspector. He never wrote letters, only emails. He seemed different lately. He was not sad. Inspector, she whispered, her voice trembling. He was angry. For weeks. He has been angry. Angry at who? At everyone. At the phone. But mostly at his son, Carlos. I took out my notebook. The yellow paper in the other room suggested a premeditated plan. But anger suggested passion. The two didn't fit yet. Tell me about Carlos, I said. The housekeeper. Maria was sitting at the small kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a glass of water that was shaking so hard it made a clicking sound against her ring. She was a robust woman, 60 years old, the kind of person who usually ran a household with military precision. Now, she looked small. He was not sad, Inspector, she told me, her voice trembling. He was angry. For weeks, he has been angry. Angry at who? Maria, I asked, leaning against the counter. I kept my voice soft. You don't get answers by shouting at terrified grandmothers. At everyone, at the phone, but mostly at his son, Carlos. I wrote the name down in my notebook. Carlos Alvaro, the estranged son. It was a cliché, but in murder investigations, clichés are usually where the truth hides. When did you last see Carlos? 2 days ago, she whispered. He came here. They shouted. The judge. He threw a vase. I heard Carlos scream that he would destroy him. She looked up at me, eyes wide. But Inspector, the judge, he would never take his own life. He was too proud. He thought he was God. I left Maria with a uniformed officer and walked back into the living room. The coroner was bagging the body. That was when the front door opened, and a young man in a sharp navy suit rushed in. He looked like he had just run a marathon, sweaty, pale, eyes darting around the room until they landed on the empty space where the chair was. "Where is he? Is it true?" I stepped in his path. "Who are you?" "Alberto Núñez," he stammered, flashing an ID badge. "I'm Judge Alvaro's judicial clerk. I've been his right hand for 5 years. The police called me." Alberto was the type of man I saw often in the halls of justice, ambitious, polished, terrified of failure. He looked at the crime scene with a mix of horror and fascination. "Maria told me about the son," I said, watching his reaction closely. Alberto nodded vigorously. "Carlos, yes, it's been a nightmare. Carlos has a gambling problem, heavy debts. He's been bleeding the judge dry for months. Last week, the judge told me he was cutting him off completely, changing the will." "Did the judge seem suicidal to you, Alberto?" Alberto hesitated. He looked down at his expensive Italian shoes. "He was under pressure. The situation with Carlos was breaking him. He told me yesterday." "Alberto, I don't know how much more of this shame I can take. If he wrote a note, it might be about that." It was a neat narrative. The disappointed father, the shame of a degenerate son, a moment of weakness. It fit, but I still had the image of that yellowed paper edge in my mind. We picked up Carlos Alvaro 2 hours later at a private poker club in the Tetuan district. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a wreck. He was 30 years old but looked 40, with dark circles under his eyes and the jittery energy of a cocaine user. In the interrogation room at the station, the fluorescent lights hummed loudly. I let him sit there for 20 minutes before I walked in. Silence makes guilty men talk. It makes innocent men angry. Carlos was angry. "I didn't kill him," he shouted before I even sat down. "I was at the club all night. Ask the dealer. Ask the waitress." "We are asking them," I said, opening the file. "But your fingerprints are all over the apartment, and we have a witness saying you threatened to destroy him." "I wanted money." Carlos slammed his hand on the table. "I didn't want him dead. Dead men don't write checks, Inspector. I needed him to bail me out one last time." "Your father left a note." I lied. "He says you drove him to it." I watched him. His anger felt genuine. It was the resentment of a child who had been ignored, not the panic of a murderer trying to cover his tracks. "If it wasn't you," I asked, "who was it?" "I don't know." Carlos slumped back. "But he was acting strange lately. Not sad. Paranoid. He was moving money, cash withdrawals. Small amounts, but frequent. I saw the receipts in his study when I was looking for things to sell. I frowned. For what? I don't know. But he was hiding them. My father never hid anything. He liked to show his power." I walked out of the interrogation room feeling heavier than before. Carlos was a leech, but he wasn't a killer. His logic held up. The judge was his piggy bank. You don't smash the piggy bank until you're sure you have all the coins. I went down to the forensics lab in the basement. The air smelled of chemicals and ozone. Elena was sitting at her microscope, the suicide note clamped under the lens. "Raul, you were right about the paper," she said without looking up. "It's old. It's not just old, it's specific." She pointed to the monitor. "I analyzed the fiber composition. This isn't the premium bond paper he had in his home printer. This is government issue recycled standard A4. It's the cheap stuff. Where is it used? Government offices, ministries, police stations." She paused. "And the courts." I felt a click in my brain. The judge didn't write the note at home. He wrote it at work. "And the ink?" I asked. "That's the strange part." Elena frowned. "The signature Manuel Alvaro is written in blue ballpoint ink. The pressure indicates it was written quickly, confidently. But the typed text, the toner is sitting on top of the microscopic paper fibers in a way that suggests the paper had been handled significantly before it was printed on. Handled, folded, unfolded, maybe stored in a file." I looked at the text of the note again. "I have betrayed the trust placed in me. I cannot live with the shame of what is to come. Forgive me." It was vague, generic. "Elena," I said, a theory forming in my head. Sharp and cold. What if he didn't write this note about suicide? What if he wrote this note about a work mistake? A procedural error? A lost file? And then someone brought it to his house. Exactly. I needed to see the judge's office at the High Court, and I needed his clerk, Alberto, to let me in. I called Alberto. He sounded helpful, eager. Of course, Inspector, I can meet you at the courthouse in 20 minutes. I have the keys. I drove toward the Plaza de Castilla. The sun was starting to rise, turning the sky over Madrid a bruised purple. The case was shifting. It wasn't a suicide. It wasn't a domestic dispute. The judge had signed a confession on government paper. Someone had kept it. Someone had waited. And last night, they had cashed it in. I thought about the cash withdrawals the son had mentioned. Blackmail. The judge was being blackmailed. But for what? What crime could a high court judge commit that would make him sign a confession and pay hush money? As I pulled up to the massive, imposing structure of the courts, I saw Alberto waiting on the steps. He looked small against the stone columns. He waved. I waved back, but my hand was resting on my gun. Because if the judge was being blackmailed by someone who had access to his office files, there was only one person who had the keys to everything. The helpful clerk. But I needed proof, and I was about to walk into the lion's den to find it. The Juzgados de Plaza de Castilla is a beast of a building. In the daylight, it is a hive of lawyers, criminals, and bureaucracy. But at 5:00 a.m., it felt like a tomb. The sound of our footsteps on the marble floor echoed up to the high ceilings, sharp and lonely. Alberto walked ahead of me, his keys jingling nervously. He was walking too fast. The judge's chambers are on the 6th floor, he said, his voice bouncing off the empty walls. I haven't been in since yesterday morning. We took the service elevator. The silence in the metal box was suffocating. I watched Alberto's reflection in the steel doors. He was wiping his palms on his trousers. He wasn't grieving, he was calculating. When he unlocked the heavy oak door to the judge's office, the smell hit me old paper, dust, and the stale air of a room that held too many secrets. "Don't touch anything unless you have to," I said, stepping inside. I went straight to the printer. It was an older model, a beige beast from the early 2000s. I pulled open the tray. There it was. Papel reciclado. Estándar. The government issue paper. It was slightly gray, coarse to the touch. I held a sheet up to the window. The edges were yellowed, just like the suicide note. "He wrote it here," I said aloud. "He typed the note here, in this office." Alberto was standing by the door, hovering. "Does that matter, Inspector? Maybe he wrote it after court ended. Maybe he was sitting here, looking at his career, and decided it was time to end it. Maybe," I said. I turned to face him. But why use official paper? A man planning his death usually wants it to be personal. He writes it by hand, or on his own stationery. This feels like paperwork. I walked over to the judge's massive desk. It was cluttered with files. I started flipping through them. Case 40923, case 11223. "Alberto," I said, not looking up. "You said the judge was being blackmailed. You said he was withdrawing cash." "Yes," Alberto said quickly. "To pay off his son's debts, I assume." "You assume or you know." I assume." I stopped at a file that was sitting in the pending tray. It wasn't a case file. It was an internal administrative folder. The label read Incident Report, October 12th. That was 3 weeks ago. I opened it. It was empty. My heart started to beat a little faster. This was the gap. The missing piece. What happened on October 12th? Alberto. I asked, my voice dropping an octave. Alberto froze. "I don't recall." "Don't lie to me," I snapped, slamming the folder shut. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the quiet room. A high court judge opens an incident report. He withdraws cash, and 3 weeks later, he's dead with a note printed on office paper. What happened on the 12th and an E? Alberto crumbled. He sank into one of the visitor chairs, putting his head in his hands. "It was a mistake," he whispered. "A stupid mistake." "What was He lost a piece of evidence, Alberto said, his voice muffled. A flash drive from the Gürtel corruption expansion case. It was in his care. He left it in a taxi. He was panicked. If it got out that Judge Alvaro lost key evidence, his career would be over. He would be disbarred. The shame. He couldn't handle the shame. I stared at him. So he paid someone to find it? No. Alberto looked up, tears in his eyes. He thought it was gone forever. He prepared to resign. He wrote a statement to the General Counsel of the Judiciary. He was going to turn himself in. My mind raced back to the text of the suicide note. I pulled the photo of it from my pocket and read it again. But this time, I read it through the eyes of a man admitting to a professional error. I have betrayed the trust placed in me. I cannot live with the shame of what is to come. Forgive me. It wasn't a suicide note. It was a resignation letter, a confession of professional negligence. But then, Alberto swallowed hard. The taxi driver returned it the next morning. He brought it to the front desk. The crisis was over. The judge was so relieved. He told me to shred the statement. He said, "Alberto, let us never speak of this again." I looked at the empty folder. "But you didn't shred it, did you?" The air in the room shifted. The nervous, helpful clerk vanished. Alberto sat up straighter, his face hardening. He realized he had said too much. You kept it," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "You kept the signed confession, the one paper that could ruin him." The pieces slammed together. The suicide note was typed on government paper because it was a government document. The yellowed edge was there because it had been sitting in Alberto's drawer for 3 weeks. The judge hadn't been paying blackmail to a stranger. He had been paying Alberto. He stopped paying, didn't he? I said, stepping closer to him. My hand hovered near my holster. "Yesterday, you said he was angry. He wasn't angry at his son. He was angry at you. He told you he was done paying." Alberto stood up slowly. He wasn't crying anymore. "He treated me like a servant for 5 years," Alberto said, his voice cold and steady. "I covered his mistakes. I wrote his judgments. And when I asked for a fair share, he threatened to fire me. So you went to his house," I said. "You shot him. And you placed that 3-week-old resignation letter on his desk, knowing everyone would think it was a suicide note." "It was perfect," Alberto sneered. "It was his own signature, his own words. Who would doubt it?" "I doubted it," I said. Alberto's eyes flicked to the heavy brass paperweight on the desk. Then to the door. He was 5 meters away from the exit. I was older, heavier. He thought he could make it. "Don't do it, Alberto," I warned. "You have no proof," he spat. "Just a theory about paper." "I have the folder," I said, lifting the empty file. "And I have the printer log that will show exactly when that document was printed. October 12th, not last night." The color drained from his face. The twist wasn't just that the note was old, it was that the meaning of the words had been stolen. The judge died apologizing for losing a flash drive, and his killer used that apology to get away with murder. Alberto lunged, not at me, but at the desk grabbing the heavy brass statue of Lady Justice. "Police!" I roared, drawing my weapon. But he didn't attack. He threw the statue through the glass of the office window, shattering the silence of the night, and scrambled onto the ledge. "It's over," I yelled. He looked back at me, the wind from the broken window whipping his tie. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrified realization that his clever little paper trick had failed. "I won't go to prison," he screamed over the wind. "Get down!" But the twist had one final turn. He wasn't trying to jump. He was trying to climb to the adjacent balcony, the fire escape. He slipped. It wasn't a dramatic fall like in the movies. His expensive shoe just lost traction on the polished stone of the ledge. He didn't scream. He just gasped, his hands clawing uselessly at the air. And then he was gone. I ran to the window. Far below, on the concrete courtyard of the Plaza de Castilla, a small, dark shape lay still. I holstered my gun and looked back at the printer. The machine hummed quietly, a green light blinking in the darkness. The judge had been killed by his own words, And now, so was his killer. Section 4. Climax. Resolution and aftermath. I didn't look down for long. There is no dignity in a fall like that. I pulled my head back in from the broken window and holstered my weapon. The wind was howling through the shattered glass, scattering papers across the judge's office, hundreds of judgments, verdicts, and sentences swirling in the air like confused birds. I picked up one sheet. It was blank, just like the rest of this tragedy. It was waiting for someone to write a lie on it. I sat in the judge's leather chair and called the station. Dispatch. This is Inspector Raul. We have a Code 3 at the Plaza de Castilla courts. I have a suspect down in the courtyard. Send the coroner. And send the jefe. He's going to want to see this. The next 3 hours were a blur of flashing lights and bureaucracy. The sun finally broke over Madrid, illuminating the grim reality of the courtyard below. The Policía Nacional swarmed the building. My boss, Comisario Vargas, arrived with a coffee in one hand and a lit cigarette in the other, ignoring the no-smoking signs that decorated the hallway. He looked at the broken window, then at me. You go out for a simple suicide investigation. Vargas grunted, exhaling a cloud of gray smoke. And you end up with a dead court clerk and a shattered window in the high court. Tell me you have something solid. Raul, the press is going to eat us alive. I have the printer logs, I said, handing him the printout Elena had just emailed me. Look at the timestamp. October 12th, 4:15 p.m. Document, title, resignation, draft, datu V1. It matches the text of the suicide note exactly. Vargas squinted at the paper. And here, I continued, handing him a tablet showing the bank records we had pulled from Alberto's laptop, which was still open on his desk. Judge Alvaro withdrew 5,000 euros in cash every Friday for the last 3 weeks. And every Saturday morning, 5,000 euros was deposited into a cryptocurrency account linked to Alberto's IP address. Vargas nodded slowly. The clerk was bleeding him. The judge made a mistake, I said, looking at the empty chair where Alberto had sat just an hour ago. He lost a flash drive. He wrote a resignation letter because he had honor. He was ready to quit. But then the drive was found. He thought he was safe. He trusted his clerk to destroy the letter. But the clerk saw a golden goose. Vargas finished. He kept the letter as leverage. Vargas clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. Go home. Raul, write the report tomorrow. You look like hell, but I didn't go home. Not yet. I had one loose end to tie up. I drove back to the station in Tetuan. The city was awake now. Delivery trucks were double parked, blocking traffic. People were rushing to jobs they hated. The world was normal again, unaware of the drama that had played out in the silence of the night. Carlos Alvaro was still in the holding cell. He was asleep on the concrete bench, his expensive jacket bunching up under his head like a pillow. He looked younger when he was asleep, less angry. I unlocked the door. The metallic clank woke him instantly. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, fear returning to his face. Did you find proof? He asked, his voice cracking. Am I being charged? I pulled up a metal chair and sat across from him. You're free to go. Carlos, we found the killer. Carlos blinked, confused. Who? Alberto Núñez, the clerk. Alberto. Carlos frowned. The little guy in the suit, why? Money, I said, and power. The two things your father had. I explained it to him. I told him about the lost flash drive, the resignation letter, the blackmail. I watched the emotions cross Carlos's face. Confusion, shock, and finally, a deep, crushing sadness. He didn't kill himself because of me, Carlos asked quietly. No. And he didn't write that note about me. No, I said firmly. The note was about his work. He wrote it because he thought he had failed his duty. He was willing to resign to protect the dignity of the court. He was a proud man, Carlos. But he didn't die because he was ashamed of you. He died because he refused to be a victim anymore. Carlos looked down at his hands. He started to cry. Not the loud, angry sobbing of a child, but the silent, shaking tears of a man who realizes he has wasted years being angry at the wrong thing. "He was going to cut me off," Carlos whispered. "He told me he was changing the will." "Maybe," I said, standing up. "Or maybe he was just trying to protect what he had left so he could pay the blackmailer. We'll never know for sure, but I know this: he didn't leave you. He was taken." I opened the cell door wide. "Go home, Carlos. Take a shower. Call your mother. She's alone in that big apartment." Carlos stood up. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a resemblance to the judge. He had the same jawline. "Thank you, Inspector," he said. He hesitated, then asked, "What happens to the note?" "It's evidence," I said. "It goes in a box. It gets filed away." I walked out of the station and into the bright Spanish sunlight. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and roasting coffee from the bar across the street. I ordered a café con leche and sat at a small metal table on the sidewalk. I watched the people passing by. A mother pushing a stroller, a businessman talking loudly on his phone, a pair of teenage lovers holding hands. They all looked so solid, so permanent. But I knew the truth. We are all just fragile things. We build our lives on paper birth certificates, marriage licenses, deeds, wills. We think these papers define who we are. We think they protect us. Judge Alvaro thought his reputation was written in stone. But in the end, his life was dismantled by a single sheet of recycled A4 paper that had sat in a drawer for 21 days. I took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, bitter, and perfect. The suicide note was a lie, but the yellow edge on the paper, that was the truth. It was the only truth that mattered. Nature always leaves a mark. Paper yellows, iron rusts, people break, and sometimes, if you look close enough, you can see the cracks before the whole thing comes down. I finished my coffee, left a few coins on the table, and walked toward my car. The case was closed. But in Madrid, there is always another file waiting to be opened.